much for bearing with us while we're figuring out our connectivity issues. So I'm sorry that I'm late and y'all were in the right space, but I was not. So we'll start from here. Thank you, Alexandra, for helping us with our technical issues. Okay, so for the sake of time, we'll just jump right in. My name is Leah Poole, if we haven't met yet. I'm the NCCASA's Rural Sexual Assault Services Specialist, and I'm joined here today with Marilea. If Marilea, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Marilea. I am the clinician over at Rape Crisis in Wilmington, North Carolina. I am an LCSW, fully licensed, and so able to run groups and just really figure out the clinical component. But yeah, I'm here in Wilmington. Been in Rape Crisis for about 4 or 5 years.
Thank you, Marilea, and sorry for pronouncing your name wrong.
It happens.
Awesome. And so I forgot to say that I use she, her pronouns. And so if folks want to put their name, pronouns, where they're coming from, where they work, and their role there in the chat box, just so we can be a little bit interactive, feel free to do that now. I love knowing who's here. And while y'all do that, the purpose of today's call is to talk about the support group manual addendum that Marilea and I created to help programs have the tools that they need to facilitate successful virtual support groups. So we're going to start today with 2 quick poll questions and then move into more of the details from the manual itself. So I know folks are still maybe typing in the chat. I see Nadine is here from Real Crisis, Bernice from UNCG, Maria from Victim Advocate Army Sharp, Fort Bragg. Awesome, thank you all so much for being here. So other folks might be typing. I'm going to go ahead and launch the polls. Nope, I'm not going to launch the polls because they were created in the other Zoom that we didn't have that was working. So this is just, you know, one of those technical difficulty kind of days. I'm so sorry. So I can just ask you the poll questions. So the poll question, the first one is, does your Rape Crisis Center currently have a virtual support group that you plan on continuing? And you can just put yes or no in the chat. Okay, Casey says yes. Virginia says yes. Awesome. Bernice says yes. Okay, mostly yeses so far. And I can put the question in the chat in case people missed it. And folks can respond to that. And then the second question from the poll was, do you feel prepared and comfortable to facilitate a virtual support group? And so this was supposed to have options such as very comfortable, somewhat uncomfortable, or very uncomfortable. So you can answer it that way if you would like. But just kind of, if you want to share, and you're also welcome to unmute yourself, about how comfortable you feel facilitating your virtual group. Okay, some people are saying somewhat comfortable, some are saying somewhat uncomfortable. Technical issues are definitely always uncomfortable. Yeah, obviously, I'm experiencing them right now. Okay, I am new to my organization, but we have peer leaders who are survivors to mostly lead. Okay, so your survivors lead your support group. That's great. Yeah, and I'm sure that you're there as a resource if they're having issues. So this can just be equally as helpful for you to be able to share with them or provide resources for. And so that's really the purpose of today, is whether you're somewhat comfortable, somewhat uncomfortable, or anywhere else on the spectrum, hopefully the resources and the tools in this manual will help you feel more comfortable, and maybe help you think of some things that haven't come up yet, but you'll feel more prepared if they do. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can follow along with the manual together. And then throughout the training, I really do want this to be interactive and more of a discussion, because everyone's going to utilize the information in the manual differently, because all of our programs are unique and different. So please feel free to put in the chat throughout any questions you have, or things that if you have experience with something and you have any great suggestions. I know we would all appreciate that. Hold on just a second. Okay, can everyone see the manual? Okay, great, perfect. And I can't necessarily see the chat while I'm going through this. So if Alexandra or Marilea, if there's any questions, if you just interrupt me, that's fine. Okay, so we'll start with an overview. The intention of the manual is to provide ongoing support and suggestions to programs who have already begun implementing a virtual support group or consider doing so in the future. While we're gradually returning to in-person services, and some programs may find that in the ever-evolving virtual world, they want to continue their virtual support groups, or maybe their clients prefer virtual support groups. Other programs may find that it's not sustainable at this time, and that's okay. And so the contents of the manual may not work for everyone, and we, like I said, expect folks to kind of interact with it in a way that makes sense for them and for the community that they're serving. So as you move through it, you know, you don't have to take every single suggestion that we have, and we're happy to answer questions. And so we're going to start with the table of contents. So you can just kind of see some of the topic areas we're going to cover here. And then another piece is that throughout the manual, if you're interacting with it virtually, such as in a PDF form, like I am right now, there are lots of links throughout that you can click to learn more information, or it'll connect you to a resource. But we are also going to send hard copies to every Rape Crisis Center so that they have access to them in that form as well. So just keep that in mind, that you will have two different ways to access. Okay, so we'll start with assessing agency readiness. So when thinking about starting a virtual support group at your program, or keeping the one that you started during the pandemic, which you obviously probably started as a way to meet the needs of the survivors in your community, and maybe you just kind of had to think on your feet and you had to be quick. And that's, you know, what we do as advocates. We're flexible and we adapt to the situation. And so when thinking about whether or not you want to continue your group, or you have the sustainability to do so, or if you want to start one, there are definitely some things that you're going to want to consider. And so in this section, you'll find some resources from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. They have an assessing agency readiness worksheet that you can use. And so some of the questions that you're going to find on there are, how will the service benefit survivors in your community? So obviously we center our work around survivors. And so we want to ask, you know, how will they benefit from having this virtual group? Will they benefit from having this virtual group? How would digital services support, enhance, or extend your current services? So if you already have an in-person group, how would this support that or extend that? Or if you have no groups at all, is this a good place for you to start? How would your digital services differ from other services that you already have? What other resources will you need to meet the increased number of survivors who will reach out? For example, youth survivors or survivors from another state. I've heard from some programs that while they've had virtual groups, they've gotten more interaction from folks who either aren't in their county or aren't in their state. And so, just kind of thinking through, policies and procedures or things when that happens, and how your agency is going to handle that. And then also, will you need additional staff to maintain this service? And so those are all kind of things that you're going to want to think about up front, or in this case, if you're thinking about continuing the service. And so the other piece is, a lot of our rural communities, the community itself may not be able to sustain a group due to broadband issues or like not having access to internet. And so those are also things that you have to think about. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Marilea to talk about confidentiality.
Yeah. So with confidentiality, it's definitely important when we're in person and we're meeting with clients in person, we talk about confidentiality. It's maybe a little bit different and more abstract. So in a way, when thinking of a virtual concept. And so I talk about confidentiality right at the beginning. When it comes to technology, when it comes to groups, who's in the same room, like if there's kids or spouses, like talking about those things, brainstorming ways so that the clients themselves can have full access for them, for a group, because it is kind of like a self-care for them so that they can get everything that they're looking for when attending groups. So who's in the same room with them, and then when sharing the link, I send it encrypted, crypt code. I send it individually, so I'm not sending it to a full to everybody in the group at the same time. I'm sending it individually. I also give clients the choice to either not use their video and mute the whole time if they would like, or if they want to change their name, they can. The groups have a code, a membership ID, or the ID and a code that's specific for that group, and nobody else will have that. And so we just talk about those things, and then of course getting that verbal consent that they are okay with the expectations when it comes to consent, and then ways to brainstorm if there are any barriers. And yeah. And so there are different platforms that we use that are available when it comes to virtual. Those are listed here. I usually use Zoom, but these are things to consider when looking at these different platforms and their different things that they offer. And if it seems to me, if I'm looking for something that's confidential for our clients, given the sensitivity, it's looking for what is there a waiting room feature? Is there a passcode feature? And then how to get the clients feeling comfortable using that platform.
Yeah. Is anyone already using any of these platforms? And do you want to share kind of how that experience has been for you? The 5 that we included are Doxy, Simple Practice, TheraLink, Zoom for Healthcare, and VSEE Messenger. And these are definitely, some of them are definitely more heavy, I think, in like mental health counseling, but they work because they do serve that purpose of being a little more secure. So if anyone has been using any of these and wants to share their experience, you can put that in the chat or unmute yourself. Great, thanks, Virginia. Awesome. Well, if anyone else wants to put in their thoughts on the platforms, we use Microsoft Team meetings and it's very difficult and complicated. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Casey. And I think that's like a good thing that we have to think about too, is like, one thing may be easy for us, but is it hard for our clients to access? Are there like barriers? I personally have had a hard time with Microsoft Teams, so I can definitely relate to that. So thank you for bringing that up. And you'll find here that all of these platforms are considered HIPAA compliant, which is not necessarily a requirement. There are no platforms that are considered VAWA compliant, but I think looking into ones that are HIPAA compliant is helpful, because it does just mean that there's that extra layer of confidentiality and privacy kind of built in. And again, for the purposes, like if you are not a licensed mental health professional, your platform may not have to be HIPAA compliant, but we want to do everything that we can to maintain confidentiality, privacy, and also we do have confidentiality requirements through VAWA to keep in mind. And you'll see that each of these have different funding structures, and in this section, you'll see that there are different bullet points where we kind of talk about the pieces that we pulled out that we think would be most relevant to you and kind of deciding what platform you want to use. But if you click any of the headers here, it'll take you to their webpage so you can learn more. Okay, so now we'll talk about accessibility. So there's a couple issues under here that I think you'll want to consider when you're planning to set up your virtual group. And so one of those is, or some of these are tech literacy, internet access barriers, and common tech problems and solutions. So like we already talked about, technology issues happen, they come up. And so being able to mitigate them or kind of resolve them in the short term can just be really helpful to not disrupt the group if it's possible. Sometimes it's not, and we have to go from there. But the first thing is, when we're talking about accessibility, we want it to be for the client and the staff members who are facilitating groups. Not everybody is a technology wizard. I'm certainly not. And so we want to make sure that our staff is supported so that they know what they can do and what the options are in the platform in order to facilitate the group successfully. And we also want to make sure that the group members have the tools to enjoy the group and engage in the group to its full capacity that they need to, because not everybody is going to have a lot of history using Zoom or any of these other platforms. And so one thing that I've heard from programs is that their initial session is just a session to go over how to use the platform. So you don't actually facilitate a group that day. You just invite folks who want to come and do kind of like a walkthrough from start to finish, where they log in and you go through the different features, whether that's how to access chat, how to mute or unmute, take yourself off video, how to change your name if you want to be anonymous. And so those kinds of things can be helpful just from the beginning to make people feel more comfortable engaging with the platform. And you can also do the same thing for your staff. If your staff is using a new platform, see if there's an online tutorial that they can go through. A lot of these platforms offer technical assistance 24/7, or at least for pretty extended parts of the day. They have long hours. And so it may be that you work with a technical assistance provider on the platform's end to kind of teach you how to use the platform, how to troubleshoot simple problems, things like that. And so the other piece is just access in general. Like we talked about, there are a lot of people who do not have stable internet connection or service. And so when we're thinking about that, we want to first ask, is the problem that they don't have internet access or that they don't have a device? Can not afford to pay for internet? What are these barriers? And then see what we can do to reduce them. And so if the issue is that they don't have Wi-Fi, where they're at, or they don't have access to internet, they could potentially utilize a parking lot of a grocery store or a fast food restaurant during group and sit in their car enjoying that way. That's definitely not as comfortable as your house, but it is an option for folks who may need it. You could also potentially ask YMCAs, fire stations, faith organizations, or even your local schools to see if folks could utilize their parking lots for group. Those areas may feel safer to people than just sitting in a fast food parking lot. And so just kind of thinking about those things as options. And then also your own agency. Everyone who uses, everyone who needs access to Wi-Fi, or everyone who is part of the group may also be able to come in person. And so maybe they can utilize your parking lot. They can sit in their car and use the Wi-Fi at your agency if that works for them. And then some common tech issues and solutions. You know, we've all been in a meeting where we can't hear somebody, or the sound's breaking up, or there's like a lag. So some things that you can do to solve those kind of on the fly are in here. And so that might be suggesting people use earbuds, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that might even be something that your program offers to folks as part of the being part of the group, as you provide headphones. If your video is lagging, maybe everyone in the group can turn their video off, because that puts more strain on the platform, on the service. And then also people can call in if they're having audio issues. They can call in and mute themselves on the platform, and so you can still see them if they want to be seen, but they can call in through their phone, which I'm sure we've all done before. Okay, so that's just like a brief overview. I'll check the chat real quick, and then Marilea can talk about safety planning. Oh, perfect, for a library, for private room access. Yeah, that's a great idea. Local library or hospital Wi-Fi. Awesome, thank you.
Okay, so for safety planning, again, in person versus virtual, it'd be the same mindset, but with virtual is what are we not able to see that we can see in person? What are we listening for? What does that look like for safety planning in the virtual world? So it would be, so with intakes, that's where I usually set the tone. That will be later in the manual, but just looking in when it comes to suicidal thoughts, ideations, what's the client's history? Are clients sometimes coming in for group, then not coming for weeks at a time? Like, what is that pattern? And so just having these thoughts and having a plan for you as the facilitator, and then having a conversation with the agency with so that they can support, y'all can support each other when it comes to safety planning. So what that looks like virtually. And yeah, and then using the chat room like we're doing now. I always, with the intake, and then before group, and then after check-in, and if any client needs a check-in afterwards, depending, they have that access to do that. So the intake paperwork, established safety plan, what kind of support do they have? And then with, I'm not sure how everybody's database is, but, or record keeping, but I make sure, especially the virtual, that they're providing me with a phone number and then an address. So if there is any thoughts that I can call 911 and mobile crisis, and they can go, if worst case scenario, they can go and get client to safety if need be. but yeah, so I go through all that, and then and just knowing the client, knowing their red flags, knowing any triggers that come up and how they manage that. And if it's not, if they don't give me an address, if they don't give me a phone number, then I have a conversation of why they're like, if there's any barriers, if there are any safety concerns, like with if there's domestic violence, like if there's anything like that, then talking about that and having a conversation around that and seeing if there's another game plan, and then so just having a conversation around that. So.
Yeah, and I remember, Marilea, when we were talking about the manual, you talked about how it's okay if now's not the right time for the person to be part of the virtual support group. And yeah, maybe if you're still doing in-person option, they can do that, or you can talk about other ways to engage. But it's okay to say, like, it may not be the safest time for you to join. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then it's sharing what this group is. And so sometimes survivors are not ready to share their story, especially with others. So it's having that conversation. And so that could be, yeah, along with, is this the right time for group? Is this the right time for that? And that, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so one of the helpful hints here is you can give the safety plan that you and the survivor create, that the survivor creates, that you support. You give it a code word so that if during group they feel like they need to activate that safety plan, they can just use that code word, or they can type it to you. And we'll talk about this later, but that's why it can be really helpful to have a co-facilitator for situations like that as well. Was there anything else you wanted to say about safety planning?
No.
Awesome. Okay. So this is all you too.
Yeah. Okay. So support group types. So first part is setting the tone. I say that a lot, and it's more for me personally, and then it seems to help with clients when they're walking in the door or coming in virtually, is setting the tone of what this looks like, especially for a group. So especially the sensitivity of talking about trauma. And so, and with intakes, with everything, it's just setting that tone of what the client is looking for and what will help them with this process. So again, brainstorming ways to get what they're looking for when it comes to group, that it's not harming them, but it's helping them. So yeah, contact information, getting a phone number, consent forms, if you're able to do that. And yeah. And so I think with all this, so I see teen groups, teenagers is a little bit, because they're minors and we're working with, so we need to work with the parent. And teen groups, setting the tone with teens can be a little bit of a challenge, but it's doable, and it's amazing when they're in the group and they're reaping the benefits of that. So so with teen groups is still getting a safety plan, still getting consent forms, getting consent from a guardian, but then knowing if the teen is not ready to share with adults why they're coming to group. So we brainstorm around that conversation and how to still get parent involvement, but in a beneficial way, kind of thing. Yeah, so teen groups. So we have adult groups, teen groups. Some groups can be led by others, with everyone in the group, or there can be a trauma processing group where there are, it can be a licensed professional, and then sometimes we'll have interns or non-licensed professionals in the group that are facilitating, but making sure that they have support from someone that is licensed or a coordinator, so that they have support themselves. So trauma processing group, you're going through the trauma, giving them like healthy boundaries, triggers, like processing the actual trauma. Peer-led groups can be, or coping skills can be, so there's coping skills, peer-led. Any questions around those? Around groups?
I don't see any so far, but if folks have any, please let us know.
Yeah, and then self-care, because this is amazing work, but it's also is a lot. It can be a lot for us as clinicians, as advocates, as the ones that are guiding these clients that are in these vulnerable situations. And so number one is taking care of us so that we can then take care of them, of these clients. And so checking ourselves at the door, like what do we need so that we can be the best for not just us, but for clients. When it comes to group, it's a lot of personality, a lot of traumas that we're listening to, a lot of logistics that we're trying to figure out. And so it's taking all that and what do we need? So sometimes I think of what is my self-care at the end of this group. So it's either getting some fresh air or, taking a minute before I start group, and then what do I need going for a walk around the block. It's also being mindful of counter transference. So if that is getting in their way, how are we interacting with clients? Are there stories getting attached to us? Are there stuff being linked to us, like our energy, ourselves? So it's being mindful what that is.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone have any examples of things that they've done while they've been facilitating virtual groups for self-care, or anyone have any good tips? Casey says, our peer leaders go through training to make sure they have mostly recovered themselves and can learn grounding tips. Okay, great.
I love that. I love that, Casey.
Yeah, that's awesome. More grounding, awesome. Perfect. Okay, well, folks can keep bringing in the chat if they want, and I'm going to move on to virtual group logistics. And so, these are just kind of those behind the scenes things that we want to think about before starting a group, and things that facilitators and programs are mindful of or thinking through before they start their group. So for your intake, some of your regular processes will carry over, and like getting client information and consent forms, like Marilea was already talking about. But intake is also a good time to assess the client's comfort level with using technology, like we talked about earlier, asking questions like, have you used this platform before? What kind of device do you have? Do you feel comfortable using the features in this platform? Or do you want to walk through it together? And I think one of the things that we really want to talk about and think through an intake is some of the concerns that we may have about safety. I've heard a lot of advocates express that because there's more risk involved in a virtual support group for safety and privacy, because you don't know who else is in the space, that they are a little bit apprehensive, and that kind of leads to some of their discomfort in facilitating or starting a group. What if the person causing harm is there, or they have roommates, or they have young children? And these are valid concerns, but at the end of the day, we can't control the survivor or the survivor's environment. We just have to trust that they're upholding their end of the agreement to the best of their ability, and that they know what is safe and okay for them. And so that's, during intake where you can ask, what can I do as the facilitator, as the advocate, to help you have a safe space? Are there like tangible things that you need, such as earphones or other things that somebody needs in order to make the space more private? Or kind of talking through, like, this is what I'm going to do to ensure privacy and confidentiality on my end as the facilitator. What can you do on your end? Because of course, it's not just about the individual survivor's privacy, but also everybody else in the group. And we want to make sure that we're keeping their information private and confidential as well. So you can ask questions like, where do you think you'll be able to join the group from? Is this a safe place for you to join? So just talking through some of those pieces can be really helpful before they even start in group. And that's, again, when we can say, like, maybe we can try again when you have a more secure space if it's not the right time. Something else that might change when you're doing group virtually is what time of day you're facilitating. I know that there are some people who've done groups at like lunchtime, so that people can join on their lunch break if they can't join from home, but they can join from work if that's where they have internet access, or that's where it is safer. So I have heard some groups doing kind of like an hour at lunch. And so what does that mean for your staff, and how's that going to impact your other like operating duties at the time? Do you need more staff? Are you going to have someone cover like walk-ins, or, whatever that looks like? So those are some things that you might have to think about as well. And I think most people do have co-facilitators, but just as a kind of, just to emphasize how important it is when you're having virtual groups to have two facilitators, because there are technical issues that come up, and maybe one facilitator can troubleshoot that while the other one keeps the group going, if that's possible. Or if someone in the group is having a really hard time, they are having a flashback or feeling triggered, can one facilitator kind of go into a breakout room with that person and do a little one-on-one coping skills exercise, and then come back to the group? And then also, because these groups are heavy sometimes, or stressful, or you do have all the personalities, right? Like, we're human, we get frustrated. Do you have your co-facilitator to kind of talk about, like, oh, this was frustrating, how can it be better next time? Or like, what am I, oh, bless you. What am I doing? Is there something I could be doing better to support this client? And just kind of having that other person's perspective. So those are kind of things that you can use your co-facilitator for, and it can be really helpful. And then lastly, well, a couple more things, I guess, for length of group of meeting. A lot of our in-person groups may be once a week for 2 or 3 hours. That's a long time to be on a screen, right? And so you may want to consider, is your group longer in weeks, but you only do an hour or an hour and a half once a week? Or is 8 weeks still enough, depending on what kind of group you're offering? And you can still do an hour or an hour and a half. So those kinds of things can be really helpful to think about, whether you're going to have an open group or a closed group. So you'll want to think through those things, and also, again, listening to your community and asking them kind of like, what would be helpful for y'all? What kind of groups would you prefer? Especially if you're thinking about starting a virtual group and you have clients that are interested, just kind of, get the pulse on it. Like, how do they feel? What do they want? What would be helpful? And then finally, you know, Zoom bombing, which I've personally never experienced, thankfully, but I don't know if other folks in this space, if you've experienced Zoom bombing, what was that like? And how did you handle it? Even if it wasn't in a virtual support group, if you were just like in a meeting. Yeah, I've never had that happen and I hope it doesn't. Me too. Sounds stressful. I just removed the person and made it so they couldn't come back. Yeah, that's a perfect strategy. Good. Well, I'm glad that there are quite a few folks that have not had that experience. And so just in case folks don't know exactly what Zoom bombing is, it's basically when somebody who's not invited to your meeting shows up at your meeting, and usually they're disruptive, obnoxious, kind of trolling the conversation, which obviously can be really harmful in any setting, but especially in a survivor support group. So some things that you can do to minimize Zoom bombing or prevent Zoom bombing are listed in the manual. But I think the most important point is just kind of letting the survivor know up front, like, hey, we know that sometimes this happens. This is what we're doing to prevent that. This is what we'll do if it does happen. We have a plan, but we just want to make sure that you're kind of aware of all the risks that are potentially there if you're in a virtual group. Okay, and so we may run over since we got started late. If folks have to leave early, that's okay. Again, this is being recorded. And you can email me or Marilea and ask us questions afterwards if you need to leave early. So virtual support group costs. Supplies that are different from your in-person groups, maybe earbuds, like we talked about. So you may need to build that into your support group budget where you haven't in the past. A lot of other things like writing utensils, handouts, stress balls, journals, those things you may already have in your support group budget. But one of the barriers that virtual support groups kind of helps with is transportation. And so if folks don't have transportation to come to group, they may not have transportation to come pick up the materials that they need for group. So that's when you may need to think about putting postage in your budget, which seems like such a small thing, but those are things we have to think about sometimes. It's like, how much is it going to be if we have to mail this to 10 people? So that's one addition. Also thinking through support groups can be really helpful. Virtual support groups can be really helpful for those who are deaf or hard of hearing. So if you are going to offer a support group and you know that there are people in your community who are deaf, hard of hearing, or have another like hearing related disability, we want to make sure that these groups are accessible to them. So you may need to build into your budget an ASL interpreter during your group time, or making sure that the platform you have provides closed captioning. And if that's an extra fee to add on closed captioning, do you have the budget for that? Because we don't want anyone to feel like they can't join the group, and we want to make it as accessible as possible. And then lastly, something that you might want to think about is the platform itself. I know right now a lot of programs have probably gotten like a year-long Zoom subscription because we've been doing everything on Zoom. But as that kind of subsides, if it does for your agency, it may not. Some people may only be using the virtual platform for support groups. And so if that's the case, is that fee that you have to pay in order to have access to the platform going to come out of your support group budget, from another budget, and how are you going to balance that? So those are just kind of some of the nitty-gritty cost things that you may want to think about. And finally, marketing your virtual support group. So not going to be that different probably than what you're already doing, whether that's direct outreach to people who you know are either interested in a group or would benefit from a group, maybe sharing on your social media, putting flyers out in your community. But there are some pros and cons of support groups that you might talk about in your flyer. So obviously there are some risks and maybe some more privacy risks involved, but there's also more opportunity for anonymity, which a lot of survivors may really like. I've heard that a lot of male survivors have joined virtual support groups because it feels like a more anonymous and private space, and there's often a lot of stigma around male survivors coming into spaces. Sometimes they may not feel like the spaces are actually for them. So being able to come and be anonymous has increased their engagement and participation, which is great. And so those are things you may want to say, like, this is a more anonymous space. You don't have to share your name if you don't want to with the group. And another piece of that is people have really loved doing therapy and groups from the comfort of their home. That, like, for people where their home is their safe space and going out into the world is stressful, being able to be in that space during group can be really helpful and be really just feel more healing, feel more safe. So those are some things that you can market as kind of pros if people are weary or not sure what the benefit would be. And then finally, in terms of safety and privacy, again, just making sure that we're careful not to put links to the group meeting on anything that we're marketing, or, like Marilea said, not sending out the link in like a mass email, making sure you're sending it individually just in case, and being careful about that. So that is basically an overview of everything that's in it. Of course, there's a lot more information than we were able to cover. Are there any questions before we talk about some of the other handouts that you can find in the manual, and Marilea will talk about those, but any questions? Or examples that you want to share? We're having trouble getting a peer leader to volunteer to host our book club. Any ideas? Yeah. What do folks think? I'll let other people answer before I share. I can come up with most of the workbook and discussion, but we want a peer leader to be the facilitator. And a peer leader is a survivor, right? Other folks may be typing, but the first thing that I think about is going back to that assessing, like kind of a needs assessment, or assessing the community, assessing the folks that are in the book club or your agency, and thinking through, like, who is the book club for? Who asked for the book club? Is it something that y'all are doing because you think it would be helpful, or is it something that the people in your community and the survivors that you're working with have asked for? Because if it's not something that they've asked for, maybe they have another idea of what they would want to do, and someone would be more willing to volunteer to lead that. So that's kind of one thing. And then also thinking through, why do you want a peer leader to be the facilitator if they don't feel like they can, kind of respecting that, and thinking through, like, well, if no one's ready to volunteer for that now, maybe we table this idea for in the fall, or something like that. Because I think book clubs can be great, but if there isn't engagement, it's not going to be as successful. So maybe there's something that someone is willing to volunteer to do now, and you can move this to another time. And Marilea, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking if what it means for them to lead, like if they feel like there's pressure or a responsibility with leading a group, like if there's any feelings around that, just to explore and see that there is support. I think that like with interns, anybody can run a group. Anyone is more than capable to run a group, but it's what are they feeling about it, that if it's public speaking or speaking in front, or feel like they're not capable or think they don't have the answers to give when it comes to something that may come up within group, but knowing that they have support and then they can do it. And if they don't have the answers or the flow, I think that's okay too, that it will come gradually. So
yeah, I agree. And I think Virginia has a great suggestion, maybe co-facilitate with a staff member, intern, or volunteer. That could be really helpful. Also, I see that Bernice asked if an incentive would be helpful. And so I think it depends again on your program, thinking through why you're doing the group, who the group is for, whether or not an incentive is appropriate, but it could be. So great. Are there any other questions? Thank you for asking that, Casey.
I do have just a question of with managing groups, if there's any questions or advice or anything that you all have with running groups when it comes to managing them, and if like personalities can like if there's a client or someone that tends to ever run group, or if there's anything like that you guys have that you've seen or are thinking of that you like support with, or just to explore. So I know for me it's like yeah, when it comes to with engagement, like with virtual, it hasn't been that when it comes to managing personalities, because I feel like there's a lot more to do with a group on virtual, because you can use the shared platform, there's so many things to do when it comes to a virtual, the virtual world. So yeah, any questions around that or anything?
So Leah's internet just dropped, so that's why she disappeared. So hopefully she'll be able to get back on soon. I don't know if there was much more that you wanted to add, or if you wanted to close out. It's up to you while we wait for her internet.
Okay. There.
Oh, there we go.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on today. It's not my day for technology. Were there any responses to your question?
No, but just to throw it out there.
Okay. I know one of the last things that we were going to talk about is we do have some examples of some intake forms and things like that in the manual. So those were shared with us from Marilea. So if you want to talk a little bit about those forms, how you use them, things like that.
Yeah, so this first one is what seems to be very helpful with groups of getting them into group and just starting out. So this is our check-in. So I asked them, how was your week mentally, physically, spiritually, and mentally on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being high, 1 being good, and just giving a number. Spiritually, that word, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be religious. It can be anything that they define as spiritual. And so they give a number, and that tells me right there when it comes to safety and checking in of where they're at and what me as a facilitator, what I should be looking out for, kind of thing. And so that gives me a check-in for me. And then if they would like to share what how the best part of last week, low week, and if there's anything that they would like to talk about or need from the group today. So it gives them some ownership and the floor to, if there's anything that they're needing. So some will come in and they've had a rough day, like with court. It can be anything. And so we just give them that support that they need. And if there's any topics that they would like to talk about in the future, they have that too. And then this is our intake. We can definitely change the top piece, like if you're doing a teen group or if it's co-ed. But this is our intake form. And this gives me all the questions on here, gives me an idea of where they're coming from, what they're looking for, what is their history, and definitely the top part with contact information. So just things for me to know. And then, yeah, so if there's involved with anybody, anyone else. And then medications, diagnoses, what is your trauma history, any medications, and I just help, again, for safety and just knowing what they're looking for, and if there's anything that could present as a barrier that we can address so that they can get the full, be fully enjoy group. And then I think the bottom is our, yes, so going through the confidentiality. And this is where, with them going through the group rules and initialing, it gives them some kind of, so it gives that chance to have conversations so that if they are, when it comes to Wi-Fi, or if it comes to not being able to get away from spouse or kids, or if there's anything else, that's my way to have that conversation with initialing. And this could change to whatever group you're, whatever you guys are looking for. So yeah, and then signing.
Awesome, thank you. And so those are all things that you can print out and use and adapt for yourself. They're also available, of course, when you get the hard copy, you can make copies and again, adapt to your needs and whatever that looks like for you. So, and then on the last page, you will find some resource links that are clickable that you can use to, these are just other resources, suggestions, best practices, and things like that. So I'm going to stop sharing, and again, I know we're over time, so if anyone has any last minute questions or wants to get feedback on something, this is a great time for that. NCCASA is open and available for y'all to ask us any questions. We can provide ongoing support for you around this issue, so don't hesitate to reach out to me. I know Alexandra put my contact information in the chat, and Marilea also provided her contact info, and she's happy to answer questions. So yeah, any lingering thoughts, suggestions, things that you found really helpful, things that you're like, oh, I'm already doing that.
Mhm.
Looking into other platforms, yeah. And I don't know that Microsoft Teams is always the most confidential either. So I would definitely see what else you might be able to find.
Yeah, we've used Microsoft Teams as a staff, and I could definitely, feel you on that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, same.
All right, I'm going to put one more question in the chat that was supposed to be a poll question. Any way that you answer this is really helpful, and any feedback that you want to give me one-on-one, feel free to email me. We really want this to be helpful to you and to the people that you're serving. So did this training help you gain a better understanding of how to facilitate or sustain a virtual support group? And you can just answer in the chat or unmute yourself. Oh, good. Thanks, Alexandra. Are there other things that you wish we had covered that we didn't, that, you know, I can, you know, do something supplemental? Great. Casey says going to focus more on how clients are feeling about technology too. All right. Well, I guess we'll finish up for the day. Thank you all so much for being here with us. Marilea, is there anything else you want to say?
No. Thank you guys for attending.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, if you need anything, just let us know and have a great weekend.